Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I just wanted to welcome you to today's program. This is one of the High Point Historical Society's educational programs. My name is Julie Rayner, and I welcome you on behalf of the High Point Historical Society and the High Point Museum. The High Point Historical Society collects, preserves, and showcases the history of Greater High Point to foster a shared appreciation of our community reflected in the stories, events, and traditions of our past. We extend our invitation for you to join our organization. Please see me afterwards if you're interested in more information. Today we welcome our presenter, Joshua Brown. Joshua Brown is in his 7th year as pastor at Springfield Friends Meeting, one of the oldest Quaker churches in the area, which is celebrating its 250th birthday in 2023. He is the editor of the 100th anniversary edition of the autobiography of Alan Jay and A Good Idea of Hell, Letters from a Chasseur à Pied, a collection of letters from the trenches in World War I, as well as devotional books, family histories, and humor collections. He builds folk instruments and has collected more than 1,000 songs, which he shares with schools and community groups. In his spare time, he enjoys wood turning and walking in local state parks. Welcome, Joshua.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming out this morning. The purpose of this talk today is not for me to brag about the church where I work, but to try and talk about the connections between Springfield Friends Meeting, which is one of the oldest continuously occupied congregations at this end of the county, and to talk about the connections between Springfield and the growth and development of High Point. The reason for that is that, not to be too modest, if Springfield Friends hadn't been around, there's a fairly open question whether High Point would be around, because we have been involved in just about everything that has ever happened here in the city of High Point. Springfield Friends Meeting was founded 3 years before the Declaration of Independence. That's coming up on our 250th anniversary next year. And we have been continuously operating for 249 years now. And we are very, very interested in the present. For that, you need to come to church on Sunday. But our past has been very interesting to us, and we hope for you also. The earliest members of the Quaker community came here from 3 different directions. The first group came from down in Bush River, South Carolina. And they had initially landed in South Carolina, Savannah, made their way upstream and founded the community of Bush River, which is now known as Camden, South Carolina. The Quakers were the first church anywhere to say that you could not be a member and keep slaves. And we made that determination just about the same time as the Declaration of Independence, 90 years before the Civil War. The Quakers in South Carolina wanted to kind of disentangle themselves from the increasingly slave-dominated economy. And so they made the decision to pick up stakes and move up here to North Carolina. The interior of North Carolina was relatively, I say relatively, free from slavery at that time. Another group came down from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, along the Great Wagon Road, and they came primarily looking for affordable farmland and for an easier climate. There's also another group of Quakers who came down from Nantucket Island. And again, Nantucket's a small place and was getting fairly overcrowded. And so they were looking for opportunity. Most of the Quaker families were related to each other one way or another. And so they were joining people who they already know. Now, take a look at that list and tell me if you recognize any names on there. Anyone? Any of you related to any of those names? If you have one of those names in your family, chances are better than good that you have Quaker ancestry. And these are the names of first families from those 3 different locations who settled in Springfield. Let's start getting specific and start talking about connections between the Quakers and the future of High Point. Nathan Hunt was one of the first families in Springfield. He was also among the very first settlers from Guilford County who moved down to the southern end of the town. He was born in Greensboro in 1758. The Battle of Guilford Courthouse was literally fought 1 field over from the Hunt farm, and Nathan Hunt helped to nurse surviving soldiers wounded on both sides from the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. He then moved down to what is presently Thomasville and helped to establish Pine Woods Friends Meeting, but eventually thought that he would come a little closer to civilization and to school which Springfield had started and bring his family a little bit closer to civilization. He was a traveling minister. Quakers don't ordain people, but we recognize that some people that God calls them to speak in public more, to take an active part in ministry, and he visited every one of the 13 colonies, building up Quaker meetings. He was one of the movers and shakers behind the founding of Guilford College. He was, his son, Nathan Jr., was the first mayor of High Point when it got settled. Nathan Hunt was probably the best known Quaker in this area during his generation. Just let's make a little tie between the Quakers and the High Point Museum. The Hogan cabin, have any of you seen that here on the grounds? That was the home of Philip and Mary Glendenning Hogan, who moved. They actually came from England and Wales to Pennsylvania, then moved down here. And this was their cabin, which was eventually transported here to the High Point Museum. Mary Lyndon Hogan is the first recorded burial at Springfield Friends Meeting. And when she was in her upper 80s, her husband was several years older, she said, "Philip, I have followed thee from Scotland to Pennsylvania and down to here. I would like when I die for my bones, my body to be carried and buried at Springfield. I know that my children and grandchildren are going to be growing up here. I'd like to be near them." At that point in time, most Quaker burials were not marked with a stone. They felt that was kind of vanity, and kind of the idea of earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and we're all buried together and we don't need stones. Stones came in another generation or so later. Anybody driven through Archdale, North Carolina? Most of the people in this room. Archdale was originally known as Bush Hill, named after Bush River, and Archdale was eventually renamed after John Archdale, who was the first and so far only Quaker governor of North Carolina back in colonial times. One of the things which really is going to tie Springfield Friends Meeting with the wider community is the tremendous Quaker interest in education. Quakers were, back in England, banned from attending any of the publicly supported schools in the country. And Quakers, if they wanted to be educated, had to set up their own schools back in England. Quakers placed a very high value on literacy and education generally. And most of the Quaker meetings here in this area, when they were started, the very first thing they did, often before setting up a church, or a meeting house as our churches are called, often the very first thing they did was to put up a log cabin for a school. And this is a picture of one of the very early schools at Springfield Friends. It was also the home of the very first Sunday school program in the whole state of North Carolina. And I want to digress for a minute and talk about what Sunday schools were back in the early 1820s. All schools, there were not any public schools whatsoever back then. All schools charged tuition. And most families sacrificed a great deal in order to pay the tuition for their kids to go to school. Poor children, and also children who worked on farms and couldn't be spared during the week, they went to Sunday school. And Sunday school included a good deal of Bible memorization, but the Bible was used primarily to teach kids how to read. And Sunday school at Springfield ran from 8 in the morning until 10 in the morning, and included a lot of spelling bees and math lessons and all those kinds of 3 R's things, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And Sunday school was to teach basic literacy and basic arithmetic to poor children whose families couldn't afford to send them to school. And over the years, literally thousands of children attended the Springfield Sunday School. After Sunday school let out, we had meeting for worship, which ran for a couple of hours. The kids would come back after lunch for another dose of Sunday school education, and then along about 3 o'clock or so, the Quakers would come back for afternoon services. So it was humming on Sunday afternoons, and kids would literally come from as far as 8 or 10 miles away for the opportunity to attend the free Sunday school lessons. Quakers are often known for our connection with the Underground Railroad. And Springfield was one of the hubs at this end of the county for the Underground Railroad. Now, the Underground Railroad is filled with stories and legends because it was extremely illegal to harbor or aid an escaping slave. The penalty for helping one slave to escape ran as high as $1,000. And back in that era, a working wage for a fully grown man was $1 a day or less. So you can imagine what a fine of $1,000 would have meant at that time and place. The fines were literally intended to bankrupt anyone who had the nerve to help an escaping slave. In spite of all that, many Quakers, because by the 1820s, we had been free from keeping slaves for 50 years, and took the whole idea of slavery as inherently evil. Quakers got involved with this, but because it was so illegal, nobody kept written records at all. One of the very few people who wrote down years later what it was like to be a conductor on the Underground Railroad was Alan Jay. And his autobiography, which is over there on that table and available for purchase after this talk, Alan Jay gave us one of the few written records of what it was like to be a conductor. Across the street from Springfield Friends Meeting is the Alan Jay house, where he lived with his wife Martha for 8 years following the Civil War. Before then, it was built by Matthew Coffin, who was the clerk or head of Springfield Friends Meeting. And we have every reason to believe that the Allen J. House, or the Matthew Coffin House, was very probably a stop or a station on the Underground Railroad. It is still in use today. It's used by a group of people from 15 Quaker churches across the area who do mission and relief work. They're meeting there right now, in fact. They come on Wednesday mornings. But inside the house, a hidden stairway leads up to a place in the attic where it would have been relatively easy to conceal escaping slaves. Even more directly, over next door to Springfield Friends, at the Museum of Old Domestic Life, we have this stone. And according to oral legend passed down through 2 or 3 generations, this came from the Allen Tomlinson farm. And Allen Tomlinson, who we know from many sources, was a very, very strong abolitionist. But we believe that this stone, and you can see the arrow scratched into the surface of it, would have served as a marker pointing slaves on to the next stop on the Underground Railroad. Let's talk about another place where Quakers were involved in the development of High Point. How many of you have crossed Plank Road going up north along Main Street? Either none of you have driven in through North High Point, or you're very shy about holding up your hands. Plank Road is still there. And it followed the Plank Road, which was built in the middle 1850s to provide the first reliable transportation from Fayetteville, which was at the head of the navigable portion of the Cape Fear River. It was the only way, really, to transport heavy wagon loads of goods from Fayetteville up into the interior. And it follows this kind of wavy line along here. It ran from Fayetteville up to Winston-Salem and on to Bethania, which was a large settlement of the Moravian Church at that time. And it opened the state for the first time to any kind of heavy commerce. The Plank Road didn't last for very long. About 5 years afterwards, the first railroads started coming through North Carolina. And the railroad in this area ran from Charlotte and Salisbury up to Company Shops. And where it crossed the old Plank Road was the highest point on the railroad in that area. Guess what they called that crossing point? High Point. This is why we're here, folks. Now, the Plank Road was, and the railroad for that matter, were built by a combination of subsidies from the state of North Carolina and private investors. And many of the private investors were given large blocks of stock in the Plank Road or in the railroad. And in exchange for building one of those 2 lines, or providing material, or providing labor. And members of Springfield were very deeply involved in building both of the Plank Road and the railroad. At the Museum of Domestic Life, Old Domestic Life, which is right next door to Springfield Friends, we have quite a lot of artifacts from the old Plank Road. We have planks themselves. We have a tin horn, which was used by drivers to warn the next stop that they were coming. There's a milepost for people who couldn't read. There were quite a few of those during the day. You can stop and count with your fingers the notches on the milepost to know how far it was till the next station. We've got a model of a toll booth on the Plank Road and a whole bunch of other stuff that I haven't included in the picture. Tar buckets for treating the road, other buckets for putting axle grease on the squeaky wooden wagon wheels, all kinds of things. That's part of our history too. Among the earliest industrialists here in High Point, you've heard me mention Alan Tomlinson as an abolitionist. He was also the owner of one of the first good-sized mills in Bush River, long before the city of High Point was ever thought of. He ran the largest tannery here in the area, and people would come from literally 100 miles around to Tomlinson's tannery, trading their farm-grown hides for finished goods. He eventually wound up having a store and a warehouse to handle all of that trade. He built the first steam-powered factory here in the area. During the Civil War, almost all of the men of military age were swept up into the Confederate Army. Quakers were pacifists, had been for over 200 years at that point. And so the Quakers petitioned the legislature to make an exception for Quakers to stay out of the draft if they stayed home and contributed to the war effort. And Tomlinson's made shoes on a very large scale for the Confederate Army soldiers. And anyone who worked at Tomlinson's was exempt from the draft. And young men who'd never made a shoe in their life, he hired to teach them the trade so they could stay out of the Army. William Petty, a name many people don't know anymore, but in his day he was the largest factory owner in High Point. He owned the first millwork, that means making doors, windows, door frames, window frames, any kind of finished stuff that went into the building of a house. He was the first large-scale millwork owner in the area. One of his partners was Moses Hammond, who was famous not only for making millwork, but also constructing some of the first houses that weren't log cabins. And he also was head of the North Carolina Temperance Party and ran for Congress and for governor on the Temperance Party ticket. Back to the railroads. John Carter, and out in the main part of the museum, you have one of his pictures there also. John Carter built 5 miles of the North Carolina Railroad just east of town, and he was the only contractor or shareholder in the state to build any section of the railroad with free labor. Jeremiah Piggott, who was another member of Springfield Friends, as his contribution to the railroad, built the depot. And he also, to build a little more profit, built the first hotel here in High Point to serve the people who got off for a rest or were transferring to the Plain Road. Downtown High Point would not have been here if it weren't for friends from Springfield Friends Meeting. In 1847, Joseph Hunt, grandson of Nathan Hunt, sold 247 acres of what is now all of downtown High Point to Jeremiah Piggott. As I said before, he built the first hotel, the Barbie Hotel, to serve railroad passengers. Other Quakers got in on the act, and the Bellevue and the Elwood and several other early hotels here in the area were built by Quaker entrepreneurs. I mentioned that during the Civil War, that many Quakers were pacifists, and I mentioned how Alan Tomlinson provided a shelter from the draft. Other Quaker young men from Springfield Meeting, such as Seth Laughlin and William Hockett, were forcibly drafted and refused to carry a gun. And they were tortured and threatened with death to try and force them to bear arms, starved even, not given any food for days on end, to try and force them to take up arms. Quaker leaders, including 2 from Springfield Friends Meeting, successfully petitioned the North Carolina legislature to create a draft deferment. It wasn't free, you had to pay $500 to keep from being forced into the Army. And again, back in the day, that was quite a large sum of money. But these young men underwent torture rather than go into the Army in a war they didn't believe in. When the end of the war came, the last large unit of the Confederate Army was General Johnston's, which surrendered formally near Durham. That's where the headquarters where Johnston and Sherman met. But the bulk of the army was gathered down here near High Point. And the last organized unit of the Confederate Army laid down its arms in a field almost a stone's throw away from Springfield. In fact, there's a marker still down on South Main Street where you can go and see where it happened. When that took place, most of the Confederate soldiers were given the last of the Confederate treasury, which worked out to be about $1 apiece, and made their way home after years of war. And they just dropped all their military equipment right where they stood. And for a generation or two afterwards, souvenir hunters came and picked up everything from grape shot and cannonballs to bayonets. And we have 2 or 3 of the bayonets that came from the surrender at Springfield Friends. You've probably heard the saying from the prophet Jeremiah that they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. A Quaker blacksmith, probably with a little of that Bible verse echoing in his mind, beat several of the bayonets and turned them into sickles for harvesting grain. At the end of the war, people don't realize this now, but at the end of the war, the economy of the South was prostrate. And part of the reason for that was when the war ended, Confederate money became useless. It was no longer legal tender for anything. And the Confederacy had gone through ruinous inflation during the final years of the war. But anything you had in the bank, any stock that you'd been forced to buy to support the war effort, anything denominated in Confederate dollars was waste paper overnight. And the economy of the South, and especially in the industrial areas, pretty much went back to barter for the next 5 or 10 years because nobody had any cash at all. Quaker families who had endured the Civil War were leaving literally by train loads to go and stay with their families in the Midwest. And the Quaker communities of the South were about to be completely depopulated as a result of this runaway inflation and complete lack of money. The Baltimore Association was a group which formed, its long name was the Baltimore Association to Assist and Advise the Friends of the Southern States. Baltimore Association, it was just easier to say that. But the Baltimore Association was formed with the idea that it would be better for Quaker families and others to stay here in North Carolina where they owned their own farms, rather than arrive penniless in the Midwest and go up to here buying farms and paying off mortgages for the next 30 years. It is kind of a contrarian idea, but they felt that they would be better off socially and financially to stay here on farms that they owned rather than emigrate to the Midwest. So the Baltimore Association was formed of a group of Baltimore business people who called on the entire Quaker community of North America, as well as Quakers in England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland. And they contributed to a massive relief effort, which lasted over 8 years. And it was all based, not just in North Carolina, but you guessed it, at Springfield Friends Meeting. The Baltimore Association had 3 goals. They were going to rebuild schools, which had pretty much without exception been destroyed during the war. They were going to recruit teachers from the north to come down here and staff those schools. The families of the children who went to those schools would board the teachers for free. That was their contribution. And it was kind of like the Peace Corps or like AmeriCorps. They would come down, work for 2 or 3 years, and then go back home to their families in the north. The Baltimore Association also knew they had to train local teachers. So they ran a teacher training college, what was called a normal school, based at Springfield Friends Meeting, which ran for 6 years and raised an entire new generation of teachers. They also realized that you couldn't expect people to stay here if they didn't have any way to make a living. Prior to the war, most of the farming in this area was what you call monocropping or monoculture. That means you raised the same thing in the same plot of land until the fertility was completely destroyed, and then you moved on to a different soil patch. And so people grew cotton, or corn, or tobacco, until the soil was completely worn out. And during the war, the Confederate Army and Confederate war industries took almost all of the farm implements to melt them down, to recycle the iron, to make cannon and cannonballs. So nobody had any farm animals because they were grabbed by the Army. Nobody had any chickens or sheep or anything because the Army grabbed those in the final stages of the war to feed the Army. And nobody had any farm tools. So the Baltimore Association, as kind of the biggest piece of its financial investment, was about rebuilding the farming economy of the South. And as I said, the headquarters were at Springfield Friends. Francis T. King was the Baltimore business person who was the president of the Baltimore Association. He was the intimate personal friend of Johns Hopkins, a Quaker who just happened to own the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and founded things like Johns Hopkins Hospital and Johns Hopkins University, but he also plowed a fair bit of change into this Quaker rebuilding effort here in High Point. Joseph Moore, who was at that time the young president of Earlham College in Indiana, was the first field secretary, general secretary of the Baltimore Association. His health didn't really last more than a year or two here in the area. He was replaced by Alan Jay. Anybody ever heard the name Alan Jay before? Alan Jay High School, Alan Jay this, Alan Jay that. Alan Jay, your husband's?
Bodenheimer.
Alan J. Bodenheimer. Zillions of kids were named either Alan or Jay or both. He was this wonderful, saintly Quaker farmer and minister who came down from Indiana. And he was an interesting guy because he was born with a cleft palate. And he had a very weird, whistling sort of speech that kids laughed at him. But he was also a profoundly powerful minister. And he was a peerless fundraiser. He could talk money out of the trees and went on fundraising tours all over the United States, raising money to rebuild North Carolina. He lived across the street at Springfield Friends at the Alan J. House with his wife Martha for 8 years. And their house was where all the teachers came to be assigned. School books, which were being provided by Quakers up in New York State, were brought down here by train and then distributed from Alan Jay's front room. He kept the payroll. He did the recruiting. He went out on inspection visits to 60 Quaker schools that the Baltimore Association built here in North Carolina. And they remembered him for it. So they built or they rebuilt elementary schools. They recruited hundreds of temporary teachers. They started a teacher training program for 6 years until it was taken over by the state of North Carolina. They rebuilt Guilford College, which was in ruins after the war, trained a new generation of ministers to serve the Quaker meetings, and they created what was called the model farm to demonstrate modern scientific agriculture. Now, the model farm was quite an operation. They purchased the former Nathan Hunt farm that runs between Main Street and what's now Brentwood. Quite a large farm, several hundred acres. And the idea was they would not just tell people how to farm, but demonstrate what a farm could be if you did it in a more modern way. We talked about monocropping and how that depletes the fertility of the soil. They imported tens of thousands of tons, and that's not an exaggeration, of clover and alfalfa seed. What you do is you plant that. As it comes up, those plants pull nitrogen out of the air and fix it in the roots. And then you plow it under to rebuild the fertility of the soil. They also built the first fertilizer mill in the state, down at the foot of the hill below Springfield Friends Meeting. We talked about how the Army had swept up all the iron farming implements. They set up a cooperative to sell farm tools at cost to the members. And they established a network of farm clubs across the state and a newspaper to teach people modern scientific agriculture. They also built a brand new farmhouse, which is still in existence. It's kind of right next to Fox Channel 8. And most farm families at that point lived in log cabins using materials they just gleaned from the forest nearby. And they had few windows, often no glass, often dirt floors, and they were smoky. They harbored tuberculosis and fleas, and there's awful living conditions. So they wanted to say, if you have a prosperous farm, you can live in a house like that, with tons of windows, great ventilation, well laid out kitchen, a gracious place to live. And this was sort of show rather than tell. They brought a new standard of living to an entire generation of farm families in North Carolina. Let's talk about African Americans in Springfield Friends. We talked a little while ago about the Underground Railroad. Before the Civil War, it was terribly illegal, again with fines that were meant to bankrupt anyone who did it. It was illegal to teach slaves to read. Before the war, a young Quaker farmer, Solomon Blair, ran an illegal school where he taught a handful of slaves how to read. As soon as the war was over, he built at his own expense a 2-room school for former slaves and their children, which stood at the corner of what's now Martin Luther King Drive and Centennial. Eventually, Quakers from the North brought in more funding, and it became the Penn Griffin School. The Solomon Blair was a tremendous figure in the local Quaker world. His kids donated to our current church building. I always tell people, when you come to Springfield Friends Meeting and you sit down, you're sitting in a pew which was donated in memory of the man who taught former slaves to read. That's something to be proud of. Another Quaker based at Springfield, who did a great deal for former slaves, was Yardley Warner. He had written for an abolitionist paper before the war and done a great deal to raise funds for abolitionist work. During the war, he followed behind the advancing Union Army, and as slaves were liberated after the Emancipation Proclamation, many of them did not want to stay on the farms and communities and plantations, and they followed in the wake of the Army, creating this huge mass of people who had to be fed and cared for. And that was what he was doing during the war. After the war, again, because Quakers always felt that education was the key to rising, he established a network of 30 schools for African Americans in North Carolina and Tennessee. He also started 2 small teacher training colleges to teach African American teachers. He also purchased a large tract of land in Greensboro, and he divided it up into 1-acre plots, which he sold at cost on basically no interest loans to African American families so that they could have not only a home, but a garden so that they could be self-sufficient. Unlike many people who do charity work, he didn't, kind of hold himself aloof. He went and lived in Warnersville, which is still a neighborhood in Greensboro, and actually got himself fairly unpopular with the white community because he was working in the midst of them and not apart from them. At the time of his death, he was teaching at a school called Little Davie School over in Trinity, and which was one of the schools that he had established for African American students. We're still talking not so much about Springfield, but about High Point, right? That's the purpose of this talk. You can't talk about High Point without the furniture industry. The Tomlinson brothers, Sidney and Charles Tomlinson, and there's still people alive who remember them here in High Point. They were grandsons of Alan Tomlinson, who had the foresight to sell the tannery business and get into making furniture. And they were among the very first furniture factory owners here in High Point. Sidney Tomlinson, the younger brother, was a tremendous go-getter and salesman. And not only did he make and sell furniture, but he saw all of the big furniture sales conventions being held in places like Chicago and New York and Grand Rapids, Michigan. And his feeling was, why should they have all the fun and all the money? And he was the principal founder of the Southern Furniture Exposition, which we now know as the Furniture Market. His older brother, Charles Tomlinson, was the secretary and treasurer of the Tomlinson Chair Company. And he also put a tremendous stamp on High Point as the chair of the High Point School Board, and was a tremendous supporter of both public schools and also the YMCA movement. Another early Quaker industrialist was Robert Reagan, who was president of more things than you can shake a stick at. Beeson Hardware, the Sheraton Hotel, Reagan Knitting Mills, High Point Savings and Trust, Central Savings Bank, Perpetual Savings and Loan, contributed to the High Point Library, the High Point Hospital. He was into everything. And he was known as Uncle Bob to just about every Quaker in North Carolina. A piece of our history that nobody knows about today is that for about 20 years, Quakers ran an orphanage here in High Point. It was down on South Main Street, roughly where the Peppermill restaurant stands today. And it took in both white and African American children. The orphanage was largely the work of a Quaker minister named Rufus King, who had grown up as an illiterate farm boy, was drafted into the Confederate Army, was at a number of battles. He was a medic, and was a medic at the Battle of Gettysburg. And after the terrible losses there, he just kind of walked away for a while, and eventually got called back into the military. And at the end of the war, he just started walking north and made it as far as Indiana before he collapsed, and was taken in by a Quaker family in Indiana, who nursed him back to health and taught him to read. He joined the Quaker church and became a minister, and spent the rest of his life talking about God's love and mercy to anyone who would listen to him. And he ran the orphanage and raised all the money for it. Education, again. Trinity College was the predecessor to a small, inferior educational establishment now known as Duke University. And Trinity College started down in Trinity, North Carolina. And a member of Springfield Friends recruited a young guy named Braxton Craven to come and be the lead teacher at Trinity College. Guilford College, which had been started at about the same time by Nathan Hunt and other Quakers from the area, was, for the first 30 years or more, almost exclusively built, staffed, and supported by people from Springfield Friends Meeting. That's a picture of early faculty, and half of them are members of Springfield Friends. As public schools started to be built, Springfield very naturally hosted one of the biggest schools at the southern end of the community. It served for many years until it got consolidated with Oak Hill School to create the new Allen J. School. And while the building is long gone, we still have the school bell from the Springfield School just outside my office door. And little kids always think they're being terribly, terribly brave and bold when they ring the bell and think they just pulled something off, and we smile and say, "Bring it, bring it." A little more important for the development of High Point was the High Point Central High School, which was the brainchild of Charles Tomlinson. We saw his picture a couple of minutes ago, who was chair of the High Point School Board for more than 20 years. And he very deliberately went on tours to see what were the best features of other public high schools, and he incorporated them all into High Point Central. When the school was built in 1927, for example, air conditioning was in its infancy. And as the school was originally built, there were 4 very large ice-making plants or machines into the 4 corners of the school, and fans would blow air through the ice to cool it off and make the school a little bit more comfortable for the students. The Rock Gym, which was a part of the Allen J. School, also had a strong connection with Springfield Friends. It was built as a WPA project during the Great Depression. The rocks which formed the walls of the school were collected by parents and children and brought one by one and wagon load by wagon load to build the school. It was a WPA, Works Progress Administration, project during the Depression, and funding was hung up for some reason. They couldn't figure out what the problem was. And a delegation from Springfield Friends went to Washington and showed up in Franklin Roosevelt's office and said, "We've been ready to go for 2 years." And Roosevelt, according to legend, picked up his phone, called the head of the WPA, said, "Find the paperwork, I want it on my desk now." So that's why the rock gym is there. 2 elementary schools in High Point were named in honor of Ada Blair and her twin sister Emma Blair, who were prominent members of High Point Friends, of Springfield Friends. Over the years, more than 40 members of Springfield Friends Meeting have served as teachers, administrators, and staff in the High Point public school system. In addition, we've also had teachers at Guilford, trustees at Guilford, UNC Greensboro, NC A&T, and many other schools and colleges. We were not a big part of the sit-ins, but we played a small piece of the sit-ins here in High Point. At the same time that the sit-ins in Greensboro were busy making national news, school students, high school students from Penn Griffin, occupied the lunch counter at Woolworth's here in downtown High Point. And they came for advice both to their own ministers and teachers, but they also came for advice to the staff at the American Friends Service Committee office, which was supported by Springfield Friends Meeting. So we claim a little piece of that honor. The Blair family, children of Solomon Blair, their farm is now Blair Park. The family was an amazing group of people. It included William Allen Blair, who was a school principal over in Winston. He was also the editor and part owner of the High Point Enterprise. His brother David Hunt Blair, who was a prominent local attorney, also was a commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service during the Prohibition years and was in charge of enforcing Prohibition throughout the United States. It always gives me a smile because another member of Springfield Friends, hadn't joined the church yet, but later became very active, was a young man named Jimmy Walla, who in his youth was a rum runner, ran cargoes of alcohol and fast cars all over this part of the state. Later became one of the founders of NASCAR. So when you come to Springfield Friends, I always smile to think that the commissioner of the IRS and a prominent rum runner were members of the same congregation. That just one of history's little ironies. Mentioned Ada and Emma Blair, school principals. John J. Blair, who was the architect for many years of all of the public schools in North Carolina. Emma Blair, who managed the Blair Dairy, and her youngest sister, Elva Blair, who worked on the dairy and also rounded up all the kids in the neighborhood every Sunday to bring them to Sunday school. Mary Faye, can you remember riding with Miss Elva's bus?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Can you remember riding with Elva Blair to Sunday school?
No, I didn't.
Little before your time. Okay. Next door to Springfield Friends Meeting is the meeting house which we built in 1858. It was the first brick church in the area. It was built with all free labor. And it served as our place of worship for about 80 years until our current meeting house was built. It then became the Museum of Old Domestic Life, which is a collection of things that were used in everyday life in Quaker homes in the four-county area. It's one of the hidden treasures of High Point, and it has hundreds and hundreds of wonderful hands-on artifacts. We are not in competition with the High Point Museum. You have way better funding, all kinds of staff, more kind of big things, more industrial stuff. But if you want to find out what was a Quaker home like, you really ought to come visit us. It doesn't have regular hours. You just call Brenda Hayworth and she'll let you in. If she's busy, call the Springfield Friends Meeting office. I'll let you in. Our cemetery is one of the oldest in the triad, and we get hundreds of visitors every year who come searching for ancestors. We have a marvelous, up-to-date, fully indexed guidebook. It makes it pretty easy. And during COVID, we had an aerial drone survey made of the cemetery, and we're busy connecting that with a database so that you can actually stay at home and find out where particular graves and information are online. Come back to that one in a couple of years. All of this is the work of the Springfield Memorial Association, which was founded in 1907 to keep all of this stuff alive. You maintain the cemetery, museum, the Allen J. House. We sponsor talks every year on the third Sunday of August to talk about Springfield's history. Also, a project during COVID was we created a new archive room so that serious researchers can come and look up all the stuff that we have in our files. We have membership records, family genealogies, obituaries, manuscripts of lectures, endless newspaper clippings, and all kinds of other stuff, which you're welcome to go and see. We also sponsor publications. We brought a sampling of those from the table today. And that is pretty much what I had planned to say today. We have a few minutes left. Okay. You have been very, very, very patient. Can I answer any questions, or does anybody want to chip in? Yes.
Yes, I'd like, my name is Glenn Chavers. I dabble in Black history here in high school.
Yes, indeed.
And I have sent many emails to your church, and none have ever been responded. And that bothers me.
I haven't gotten any of them.
Well, I guess I'm trying to, I need someone that I can contact and sit down with, things like Solomon Blair.
Yep. Come on up afterwards.
I'm going to get this. Yeah,
Okay.
I need that.
Sure.
I'm very interested in Quakers. And I hadn't gone to church in 32 years. I just got away from it and didn't like what was going on. But I was asked to speak at Deep River Friends, and I did. And the following Sunday, I had this strange visitation telling me to get up and go out back to Deep River. And that changed my whole life. I spent about 7 years sitting beside someone by the name of Florence Allen, the finest woman I've ever known. This other my mother, grandmother. But fine Quaker lady. Every morning, every Sunday, she came and sat beside me. And everybody laughed at us. You know, we were like two twins. And I learned how to sit in silence and communicate. But my problem is, and I've worked with the ladies that do all this quilting and so I've donated a lot of things to them. But I am very interested in some of the claims regarding Solomon Blair, because there's a dispute here between, I had talked with Max Carter, I had talked with the historian at Guilford College, and Max put me in touch with the number one in the nation. And they can find no evidence that Solomon Blair was the first white person to teach black kids in the city of Hartford. So I need to sit down and go over these things. And I think it's the way things are worded that's confusing. But when I see things in my school's yearbook, and they're saying this in their yearbook, then it bothers me. I'm in correcting things. And also the normal schools, I know you didn't have time, but I really like that idea that the Quakers came up with, creating these normal schools, because most of your black colleges started as a normal school, and people don't realize that. And but on the other hand, we have to look at after slavery, who created the schools, who educated black kids, and that was the Freedmen's Bureau.
That's right, and Yardley Warner was an employee of the Freedmen's Bureau.
What's that?
I said Yardley Warner, who we mentioned a little earlier.
Okay,
He was an employee of the Freedmen's Bureau and then struck out on his own afterwards.
okay.
So
And,
we need to talk.
Yeah, yes, please do, because I am very interested in, I talk at churches all the time, I talk at schools, and I just want to make sure that the information that I'm sharing is correct, because we all make mistakes, and I've made a lot of them. When you say something was the first, you better cross your fingers. Because
Somebody's gonna come up and correct you.
Pick up a document one day, and you're going to have to say, well, it's one of them.
Sure.
And it happens. It happened to me. Unfortunately, the News and Record has published over 330 of my columns. So I was able to use that to sort of gloss it over or whatever. But we make mistakes. And the whole
But
thing
if we make mistakes, let's get them right.
And also, does anyone know anything about the Quaker organization on Washington Street? West Washington Street at one time. And this was in the, because their High Point didn't want the NAACP involved in things, and they came to the defense. I have their article someplace. They were located on Washington Street. You can probably find it in the city directory. So there was a big presence here in terms of equal rights, before we called it civil rights, but equal rights. And that organization was right there on Washington, across North Main.
Okay. Well, we still have a little time. Any other questions? Yes.
Just a comment. My name is Doris Allred Steen. My family are recipients of much of what you've talked about. From Indiana, came to the mountains of North Carolina, Quakers who established a school. It was called Mount Hebrew School. It's near Asheville. That my dad, who was orphaned, and some of his siblings attended. It changed their lives. My dad ended up being a Methodist pastor. Two brothers were Wesleyan pastors. One brother was a full-time singer in the Quaker church. I've researched it a lot, but this clarified much of it for me, and thank you so much for that.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, my mother attended Asheville Normal Teachers College.
Anybody else? You've been very, very patient sitting here. Well, I will be available if you have individual questions. Feel free to come by and browse the book table. Thank you very much to the Friends of the High Point Museum and the staff here for graciously inviting me. And I hope that you'll have a wonderful week.
Will there be a CD available for purchase of today?
Ask these people over here.
Okay. Okay.